grandmother's grave. In preparation, she put an empty 2-pound Folgers coffee can in the trunk of our dark green 1950 Packard. As soon as we finished dinner, she would pick an armful of peonies, which she held in her lap in the passenger seat, while my dad slid in behind the wheel for the 5-minute drive to the cemetery. I sat alone in the back seat. For me, visiting this beautiful but mysterious land of entombment was a trip of uneasy intrigue. My parents' demeanor was solemn, and they barely spoke when we pulled into the cemetery and wound our way around the slope to my grandmother's grave at the far end. I felt no emotional connection with my grandmother, who had died weeks after my birth. My dad edged the car to the side of the quiet road and parked next to a faucet, where we filled the red and white coffee tin with water and stuffed it tightly with peony stems. I carried the enormous bouquet to my grandmother's grave, and before placing it beside the flat granite marker engraved with the name Teresa Cuffer, I tipped my face toward the blossoms. The pink flowers, softer than velvet, were cool and soothing when they touched my nose and cheeks. I closed my eyes and nestled my face farther into the moist cushion of petals and inhaled deeply, losing myself momentarily in their sweetness. My parents knelt, my dad on one knee, my mother on both knees, and bowed their heads over the shiny gray stone. I wasn't certain whether they assumed different fashions of kneeling because my dad struggled with back pain and my mother didn't, or because my mother was Catholic and my father an atheist. Or perhaps, I reasoned, it was a gender preference, since I was strong-backed, Catholic, and female. I knelt on 2 knees like my mother. I imitated my parents' reverent manner, our heads bent over the gravestone for a long few minutes. My mother, her eyes glistening, softly prayed the Hail Mary. My father engaged in silent contemplation. I did not like to see my mother cry or my father brought to his knee. I stared at the ground, trying to conjure up an image of the skeleton in my grandmother's grave. How different from the fleshy, fresh, and luscious flowers we brought from our sunny garden. Because a BNSF track ran adjacent to the back of the cemetery, inevitably a train or two would roar by quite near to us, behind a dense screen of trees and underbrush. Interrupted, we would stop and face the direction of the terrible clatter, quietly waiting for the sound to fade to a distant rumble. I caught only glimpses of the cars as they thundered by, obscured by foliage. The ground shook beneath us, and I envisioned bones shuddering in their graves for those few minutes, and then settling back to their eternal sleep. Before we returned to our car, we meandered across the lovely grounds, exploring the final earthly homes of countless other St. Paul Catholics who, I understood to my relief, had no concern with us anymore. They were wholly turned to experiencing their everlasting rewards or punishments. An enormous stone fireman carrying a rescued toddler towered high from its base over the graves of St. Paul firefighters. Standing in Bishop's Circle, the highest point in the cemetery, my parents directed my gaze to an expansive view of St. Paul. The domes of the Capitol and the Cathedral of St. Paul shared the city's airspace, just as secular notables like Ham, Butler, and Bremer were neighbors in Calvary with churchly luminaries like Cretan, Grace, and Ireland. When the sun sank and the elongated shadows of ancient elm trees blended with those of century-old marble angels and obelisks, we strolled back to our car. Sensing my discomfort in this land of the dead, my dad often reached down to wrap his large fingers around mine. With my hand secure inside his, a hand that worked sheet metal, I knew all would be well for me. When we pulled our car doors shut around us and headed toward the exit, the horizon was tinted the same shades of pink as the peonies we had left behind. Our car's wheels rolled faster, speeding up from a dirge to the rapid and rhythmic hum of life as we turned out onto Front Street. We traveled north on Lexington and through Como Park toward home. My parents chatted. Mundane matters again picked up our attention. The dome of the Como Conservatory glowed in the night sky over the far edge of the golf course. Beyond that flashed the red first side of downtown's preeminent bank, visible all the way to the northern border of the city. The lights of our neighborhood shone from bright neon store signs and softly lit house windows. Porch lights glowed in front yards where kids were still outside. Their quick, long shadows darted across lawns and sidewalks with them as their final games of tag were played out. I had little inclination to think about graves for another year. Now in my 60s, I realize I'm in the last third of my life. I still visit my grandmother's grave every summer, offering the gift of one peony stem. I honor the memory of my parents in the same manner. These last few years, along with my reverence, I bring a wary attention that mimics my childhood curiosity. Really, I know little more about death now than I did then. For most of my adult years, my imagination was occupied with more timely diversions than pondering my mortality. I've come full circle. My mind's eye again visualizes the possibilities of that last journey. I still live in St. Paul, only blocks from my childhood home, and just a few miles from the railroad track that passes by Calvary. Sometimes when I lie in bed on a summer night, and the breeze that drifts in through my open bedroom window is soft and quiet, I hear the faintest rumble of the train rolling along toward the cemetery. I close my eyes to recall the cool, silky touch and the sweet redolence of peonies, evening shadows cast by tall monuments on a grassy hill, and my girlhood imagination depicting skeletons jiggling inside dark coffins. And against that delicious melancholy, I can almost feel my dad's warm, strong hand reaching down to enclose mine.